All right, so this week on Reddit chats, we're going to be talking about churn. And that's a pretty popular topic nowadays throughout Reddit and just some of the conversations that we're seeing within our ecosystem. So I thought it would be interesting to get your take on it, Luke, and specifically around 4 different pillars of churn that we tend to think about it at Baremetrics. Passing it over to you, Luke, and very curious to get your take on it.
For sure. Yeah, thanks, Andrea. And I think the interesting thing is, like you say, this always comes up in one way or another. What is churn? How do I calculate churn? What should I be including in churn? And the key sort of underlying theme with this and any other question, what is LTV? How do I calculate LTV? We've talked about this in the past. The fact that SaaS metrics don't have an agreed standard to which they're calculated allows for this interpretation, right? It allows for this customization of metrics as well. So it's a blessing and a curse in many ways, in that establishing benchmarks and comparisons can be hard because my neighbor might be calculating things different. But there's also the ability for me then to really dig into my data and find what data matters the most to include in my calculations as I go forward. There's generally accepted principles around what is churn, what is LTV, etc. And we definitely sit within those guardrails. Then there is opinions on what represents the truth in these core SaaS metrics. And churn's probably obviously one of the biggest ones, right? When we talk about pillars of growth in Baremetrics, ways to grow, we want to address our new MRR. We want to expand our current customers into expansion MRR. We want to address contraction, reducing usage. We want to address churn, right? And then finally, reactivation. So churn as a pillar of growth is obviously something we can't ignore, and it pays to have a good understanding of how you are calculating churn and what it actually means to help you grow. It's not necessarily a simple formula. It's more of a policy. Like I said, you want to create a policy around what you believe churn is representing, and it will depend on several things. The couple of decisions you need to make fundamentally. The first one is, what is an active customer? Questions to ask. Do free trials count? Free plans, paused accounts, right? When is a user become active and when do they become inactive according to you? So now in Baremetrics, we have an opinion in regards to active customers versus, say, Stripe. Active to Stripe means they've commenced a subscription in Stripe, right? A box has been ticked, a technical event has occurred, subscription has started, you have an active customer. Baremetrics uses that as a lead indicator of active. We mark them as active when the first payment event occurs. We add this other layer of sort of validation on that lead before it becomes active, as an example. So that's one way to look at it. Do you want it as a technical action, start of the subscription, or a financial action, has actually paid their first transaction?
Sorry, just to clarify, what would that look like? Like, let's take a customer signs up. When would Slack or Stripe cover it, and when would we cover it?
Yeah, so yeah, again, it would depend on the infrastructure you set up and the workflows you have from your trial sign up form, right? You have a trial sign up form, you have a Stripe checkout. What you may well do is you'll have the ability to create the subscription straight away, right? Where they enter into a plan, but they might have a free window period, or they don't have to pay until their second login or something like that, right? When you schedule that payment event or that subscription actual credit card to be charged, will dictate when that customer becomes active inside our platform, as the example. So it's like just a trial sign up form, Stripe checkout. Yes, I've started the subscription, I'm in the platform, but my credit card hasn't been charged yet. I could still essentially cancel and get out of that before that's occurred, but Stripe's going to include me as active now. Baremetrics is only going to include me as active when that first payment occurs.
So to clarify, if someone starts a free trial and they've put in their credit card details again, but they haven't been charged, if they cancel beforehand, they're still counted as active in Stripe for those
Correct.
weeks.
It can be, yeah, depending on how you've got your plans and your product set up. But it's you think about it as the act of starting a subscription, starting to work with the product versus the payment event, right? And again, it depends on that trial period, that free period, that freemium, et cetera, et cetera. People do want to track those things from a conversion perspective, right? You want to see how well you're able to onboard and upsell someone from a free plan or a freemium plan into a paid plan. Should those numbers be included in your churn for the purposes of total SaaS health? Probably not, right? So you need to make a decision on that active status in that regard. Normally we look at paused accounts, right? If a user's on, let's say, a 30-day pause because they said, hey, you're just about to go into reporting season, we don't need the product right at the moment, but after we get out of that, we're really keen to get back into it. Can we just put our account on pause? Do you want to include that as an active customer? Are they in the denominator of that churn calculation? Again, just no standard, just questions to ask and figure out your own answers as to whether that applies to your model or not. And that same cancellation event will have different sort of churn rates depending on what's in that denominator, right? So again, if you're including free trials in there, if you're including freemium accounts, 100% coupons, that active status, depending on what's in the denominator of that calculation, will move it. So for us, we like to define active as paying within a billing cycle, not in any sort of grace period or free status. And then I'd suggest you start there at least and then revisit it quarterly. There may be benefit in including people that are on a 2-week pause or whatever, because it just gives you more clarity on how you monitor that cohort over time. That's really just an individual decision. But if you really want to be clinical about it, look at payment itself as the active status. The second one is sort of at the other end of the equation, is when a cancellation is subsequently scheduled, or actually client raised their hand and said, hey, don't need the platform anymore, building internally, to a competitor, etc. I want to cancel my account. Now, do you cancel them at that intent, the raising of the hand, or do you cancel them at the end of that billing period when their access expires? Most billing systems, Stripe included, will let customers cancel but stay active, again back to that active status, until the period ends. We call that cancel at period end versus cancel immediately. So, and again, this is a decision you need to make because there are benefits and risks to both of them. The cancel at period end allows you grace time to try and win them back, to try and overcome the objection, to try and figure out why not. But the quandary you have is, depending on what that grace period looks like, 7 days, 21 days, 6 months, annual accounts sometimes, right? You then start to make decisions based on the cash that should be coming in at the conclusion of that cancellation that won't be, right? And this is probably more important for annual or multi-year accounts paid up front that have indicated their intent to churn in 6 months' time. So you say you've got an annual account coming up, they're doing a vendor review, they say, hey, we actually don't need this platform anymore. Let them know we're going to churn out in 3 months' time. You as the founder, as the RevOps manager or whoever it might be, have the ability to say, okay, we're going to keep that MRR in for now, but we're going to churn it out at that 6 month. Or you say, no, look, for planning purposes, we need to start to act and behave like we don't have that MRR anymore and adjust accordingly. Because if you are starting to move into a downtrend of customer churn, and you're still having this inflated MRR number and you're making marketing decisions, hiring decisions based on this forecasted revenue that's just not there, you'll be in for a world of hurt, right? So second part of it is scheduled cancellation. The two pits are intent at cancellation. So great for the product team to say, hey, I'm canceling. And they say, okay, what can we do better? What can we help? Can we overcome this? Versus expiry, right, at the end of the period, which is great for investors and sort of reports because it keeps that MRR up until the last safe moment. But you can't mix both in the same data set, right? So you can't include some churns and then miss the others. You need to decide on one of those two things. I'd pick one, document it, and then use the other one as a secondary signal. So you can still say for a multi-year, you're going to cancel that period end from a technical perspective. So you're going to spend that time trying to win them back and get them around. But from a financial or revenue perspective, you're going to cut that at the point in time they intend there. When I used to work in a previous company and we'd work with a lot of multi-year bigger contracts, particularly like larger enterprise systems, if it came down to renewal in particular, and we hadn't received notice of churn, but we also hadn't received positive confirmation that they were renewing, I would have a 30-day window past that renewal cycle before I would include them as churn. And that was kind of my sign to the sales team to say, hey, get after it, right? I'm going to give you 30 days grace before we mark this as churn. This was only for multi-year enterprise accounts, because sometimes when you've had an account for say 3 years, 5 years in some case, and you may not have a robust account management system, you'll have these accounts creep up where the champion's gone, there hasn't been an identified replacement, your platform may be still running in the background. Like we were a data platform, so it was very easy to set and forget. And so often we'd come up to these conversations, excuse me, at the 3 or 5 year mark. We'd say, hey, it's time for renewal. They're like, sorry, what platform are you? And we're like, oh, we're a critical part of your infrastructure, didn't you know? They're like, oh, no, we're going to churn. And then a week later, they come back and go, hang on, we can't churn. You're powering all these applications in our network. And we're like, yeah, we told you that. So situations like that, you don't want to include that churn straight away, because then you're going to go through a churn and a reactivation, and it just skews the sort of accuracy of your data. So again, it's decisions based on your operating model and what you want to set. But the important thing is, do have a definition, do set to it, and that allows you to flatten out that data set over time. And I'll talk about that to wrap up as well, the importance of the quality of the data. The third one, I think, this is an interesting one in our space when we talk about our ability to recover lost payments, recover delinquencies, recover expired credit cards, etc. Delinquent customers. So when a customer fails to make a payment, are they churned? How does that impact their active status? Because at that point in time, technically, they're not paying you anymore. you can't count that revenue because it's not coming in. So what is your left and right guardrail around active status for delinquent customers? So if you exclude delinquent customers from churn, your rate looks better, but your revenue picture again is inflated, right? Because the delinquency means there's no cash coming in. But if you include them immediately, you might be churning customers who come back after your recovery sequence, right? And we see it more often than not that particularly smaller teams that have credit cards set up for their vendors, sometimes it's just a timing thing, right? They want to be very deliberate in how they manage their expenses. So they'll put a $10,000 a month cap on their software marketing credit card. They hit that on the 29th of the month. I try and charge them on the 30th, right? It doesn't top up until the 1st of the next month. So they don't pay it off to the 1st of the next month. So it's just my timing that's bad, right? So every month I get this delinquent status. And so if I was to churn that customer every month, then reactivate them, that's not a true metric. It's not telling me anything, right? So that's why dunning sequences are so important, is because it allows you to have that sort of window of getting them back in. So the dunning window is what we would call it, is anywhere between sort of 7 and 21 days. Again, depending on your billing cycle, depending on the engagement with your customers. And sometimes you want to have a custom dunning cycle for certain customers. If they're high value enterprise and you want to sort of massage that arrangement a little bit there. So really what we would advise here would be, in the conversation of churn, I'd start to move those delinquencies into like at-risk MRR, right? Because delinquency can be a lead indicator of churn, particularly where it is a purely, I'm just not paying that bill and they can churn me out. That happens, right? So it is a red flag. It is something you need to look at, but I would suggest that the biggest definition you need to have here is, what is my dunning window? How many times am I allowing a client to go delinquent before I mark them as churn? And what is my recover sequence to ensure that I'm doing everything I can in that dunning window to win them back, or to overcome the delinquency event, whatever that is, expired credit card, failure to pay, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, the delinquency window is important. It's after they've churned. When you're deliberate with that dunning window, they become inactive. You're not including them in active MRR. Therefore, they are a churn from that point in time. If they reactivate, so be it. If you start to see a spike in reactivations of delinquent customers consistently, then your dunning window might need a review, right? It might be in one way or another, and how they consume your system is that you had a really tight dunning window of 7 days. You found out that a lot of those churn due to delinquency, right, would happen at day 8. And they would reactivate within the next 7 days. So 14 days is actually a churn reactivation. You see this real messy churn reactivation metric. You extend your dunning period out to 14 days, and you actually find the majority of those customers never go delinquent to churn or churn due to delinquency because it was just the way the dunning window was identified. Dunning window as a thought is important. And it will, again, depend on your operating model, depending on what you want to get.
What would you say is a normal dunning window?
Yeah, so for monthly subscriptions, I usually give it like half the subscription window, right? So 2 weeks for me is a good window for a monthly. For an annual account, that's another discussion. I'd probably move it out to 30 days because really it's like that. You're either having a net 60 payment or a net 30. Normally you'd have a net 30 payment cycle for an annual account anyway, where it's invoiced. So 30-day window to tackle that delinquency isn't really a problem. So yeah, I'd suggest either half the monthly or a certain number of retries as well is the other thing. You can actually dictate that in Baremetrics. You can dictate that in other platforms where you want to say, okay, keep pinging this card, keeps pinging this payment method for X amount of times. So it's not time-based, it's event-based, and then churn them out due to delinquency because you know you've exhausted it. But yeah, 2 weeks I think is generally pretty generous.
Okay.
Great. My final point here, Andrea, coming back to the start of the conversation around standards and benchmarks and baseline data of what tends to churn across multiple companies, I think is that the quality of your data matters as well. So all those components we've talked about actually require you to almost make a data definition, right? What is active? What is delinquent? What am I including? So when is my churn actually being included in the calculation? That's sort of the quality of data counts as well. Where does it become a problem? You may have duplicate subscriptions. You might have the ability to manually override in Stripe, for example. You might have customers on legacy plans that don't line up with the same as your current customers. They don't sync correctly. Mid-cycle plan changes where you've then gone through either a price increase, you've added additional products, and you've moved people onto a new plan. One thing we see commonly, which is a really tough one to tackle between systems, if we have someone say migrate from one system to another, and that new system does not look at the state of the previous system, i.e. you had all these active customers. When you bring them onto our system, we're only going to make them active from the day you start on our new system. So essentially you see this sort of churn out and renewal, or similarly, they might not be able to recognize the way the subscription was modeled on the previous system and now they're regarding them as churn. So you're seeing these like churn events that aren't churn events. They're just technical happenings, and you have to go in and manually adjust that. There's a bit of work there, but it's really about the quality of the input. What is it that the data is, what data are you putting into that calculation, and is it consistent? Can you trust it? And is it less likely to be manually adjusted for the sake of the calculation versus the actual picture inside your business, I guess. So before you optimize for churn, I'd look at auditing your subscriber count against your billing system to make sure that the metric system, i.e. Baremetrics, is reconciled against Stripe. We don't have any duplicate customers. We know what our plans are, how they match up, what those events are occurring, whether a payment event has been missed for whatever reason. Sometimes you might see something like, particularly for invoicing customers, paid outside of Stripe, right? So the individual has made a direct ACH payment to the underlying bank account, not through the Stripe. The invoice remains open, therefore it's not included. And maybe it's due to, it comes under a delinquency setting where the invoice is left open or unpaid for longer than 30 days, it is cancelled. But we find out that was just a manual error because we didn't mark that customer as paid outside of Stripe. So we want to do that reconciliation to make sure those things are being picked up across the board, right? When you do that rec, you really want to be within 1% to 2%. There may, I don't want to say there'll always be anomalies, but the likelihood that there are anomalies is always there, just because the way technical events are registered and certain fields are registered.
How often would you suggest running these kinds of audits?
Yes, I think that's really where you come down to saying, if I've set it up correctly and if I trust the data in the first place, then I can let it run and identify trends. Where I see anomalous data coming in or like something outside of trend, right? We might see a big drop in churn rate. We might see a big spike in churn rate, for example. That's when you're going to want to dig a little bit. And it's usually when you're in a high volume customer acquisition cycle. So you're onboarding a lot of new clients. You may have changed plans. You may have added a new payment system source, etc. Something's changing your operating model, and all of a sudden your metrics have shifted, right? That probably speaks to some misalignment of those events. That's really what we see usually. We'll say, oh yeah, we allowed customers to pay this amount, or oh, that's right, we discontinued that plan, but we migrated everyone off that plan onto this new one, so that shouldn't be churn. Right, we go, okay, let's dig into why that happened. So I'd suggest it really only happens, I don't want to say you have to be reactive to a anomalous data set. You can be proactive and you can do reviews regularly, but it can become cumbersome, right? So the idea is if you put the time in to get that data set clean in the first place, you can allow it to run to where like your signal really is, okay, what was that spike and why did that happen? And if you don't have an immediate answer for that based on what you're doing in your operating model, then you need to look at the systems, right? The system inputs. So that would be my answer there. It'd be great to be proactive and do regular reviews if you can manage it, but I don't think you necessarily have to if you trust the data in the first place.
That's a good point, especially when it comes to, I think the most common problem we see is plan data, right?
It's the age-old SaaS problem, right? Like your output is only as good as the data you've inputted. So dirty data in, dirty output out. You need to just really make sure that you have trusted systems, you can validate the data and you're happy with it. And again, we've spoken in other chats around, sometimes you've got a lot of data from different systems recording the same metric and it's different. It's more important at that point to pick which one best represents the data set as well, right? We talk about visitor traffic from, say, Google Analytics, Search Console, Ahrefs, SEMrush, HubSpot, right? Wherever else you might have a sync in there. And there might be a little bit different depending on when you read the report, what time zone it's based in, what sources you're actually isolating. It's great to have all that data, but more important, which one do you trust and which one are you using to make decisions, right? That's the big thing here. Same as churn, right? So I guess in saying all that, just to really wrap it up, summarize what we've spoken about. Churn is a number in the end, right? It is a percentage, it is a number in total. How much have you churned per month? What's your percentage of churn, net revenue churn, etc. But more importantly, it's a set of policies. It's a set of decisions you've made on how you're going to calculate that best represents what you're trying to achieve. And again, if we think about, well, what is it I am trying to achieve? We're trying to grow, right? We're trying to use churn as a method to grow. How do we combat that? How do we control it? And what are the reasons for it happening? What is that leak in our bucket and how do we fix it, right? So the founders who sort of understand that churn is a policy as opposed to a pure number, they can start to stop looking for benchmarks on, am I growing? Is my churn rate good? And really own your own definition of what churn is, right? Which should essentially be in line with the market anyway, but then start to tackle it in a way that's effective for you. Once you've made those decisions that I mentioned about, and again, just to cap it off as a summary, right? What counts as active? Scheduled cancellation, does it count at the point of intent or does it count at the expiry of the subscription? Delinquent customers, when do I actually include them into my churn calculation, the dunning window, which is what we discussed about being important, and then clean data. Is your data clean enough to even trust? Once you've made policy decisions around them and you have sort of a framework of this is what our churn is, right? Write them down, have them as a standard, report them. Your numbers become more trustworthy and your team stops having the same argument, or you stop having that same argument with your vendors that are managing that data for you as well about every month when your numbers don't quite match up. So having that definitional discussion is important, I guess. And so the goal isn't, well, I shouldn't say the goal isn't a low churn rate. It is. Obviously, a low churn rate would be great, but I think it's more important to have a defensible churn rate in that this is our churn. Yes, I'm working to decrease it, but I'm happy with the calculation because I've included these elements of our churn calculation. So how can Baremetrics help you with this? Obviously, we report on churn as one of our sort of core SaaS metrics. Retention tables, monitoring churn over time for different segmented groups, super important. We talk about the delinquency window. We have Recover to help you recover lost payments, to help you tackle delinquencies, to go through an automated sequence of making that payment occur, defining your dunning window, and then actually having action behind it, not just saying, oh, if they don't pay after 7 days, we'll churn them, right? There needs to be action in there. And then that reconciliation of data, like we mentioned, Baremetrics, some of the things we always do is almost daily. We're doing an account rec with a client in Stripe and Bare, not because it's a bad thing, but because we want to continually validate that model and make sure that what the client is seeing in their Stripe and then acting on in Baremetrics is as close to their expectations as possible. So if we do have an anomalous event, we want to understand why. We want to give them that trust in the data and then subsequent trust in our insights that we're giving them from that from those metrics. So yeah, any final questions on that, Andrea? This has been a really productive chat.
Yeah, it's been really great. The only thing I have to say after was these are setting up your fundamentals, right, of how you think about churn, and these are key for just getting a sense of how you at your company internally think about churn, but also the second part of this is understanding why people are churning.
100%. Yes. The next level obviously is once you've agreed upon the standard of what is churn, right? We then have, as a lever of growth, if we're identifying initiatives around reducing churn, we need to understand the reasons. And again, so off the back of Recover, we do have cancellation insights, allow users to capture why users are churning at that point in time. And more importantly, find that intelligence around that churn picture. What I think is a really great example of where this becomes beneficial is if when you look at churn, are you looking at just the subscription itself and everything around it? So we just lost a customer today for a particular reason, right? That's a one way to see that churn reason. Where I like to really dig in, and this becomes important on quarterly board reports, etc. How many customers did I lose, right? Individual accounts, and what amount of revenue did I lose per reason? And what you might find is that you start to see a trend on the size of your accounts, for example, and the reason they're churning. With us, sometimes we'll see larger accounts churn out because of building internally. They got so big they needed to combine multiple systems. So yeah, really love Baremetrics, but unfortunately we're building an internal tool to link up all our systems. And I'll see that. So that might be a higher revenue churn, right? But the total accounts is less. When I look at where did I lose the most accounts, and it may be a lower tiered plan, so my lower growing customers, and they'll say something like going out of business, right? Or switching to a competitor, or didn't have the features that I needed, right? So I can't just address building internally for my entire client base just because it had the most amount of revenue churn. When I look at customer churn as well, I actually lost a lot of accounts that could have grown, right, over time. So potential revenue, because I didn't have a feature set thereafter. So if I was to dismiss that churn due to feature set based on the number of active customers versus the total revenue, then I'd probably miss an opportunity to plug that gap, right? So yeah, absolutely, churn insights is important to say, where am I losing and why? And then how can I improve on that over time? Another really interesting one I've seen our clients use in particular, if you have a very competitive market and the switching costs are low, then one of your churn reasons might be, I switched to a competitor. Right? Switching to a competitor as a reason. And so after a quarter of reporting, you see that that churn reason represents 60% of your total churn for that month was because I switched to a competitor, right? So you're thinking to yourself, okay, how do I follow up on that? And what competitor is it, right? More than likely, the best thing you can do for the next quarter is, instead of having these other churn reasons in that survey to say like feature set, budget, whatever, you actually throw in maybe your top 3 competitors and say, I'm leaving you for competitor A, B, and C. Now you start to see, actually, of that 60%, half that cohort went to one competitor in particular, right? I can now see that feature they're offering is what they're directly comparing us to, and I can now tackle that directly, as opposed to being, again, nebulous and saying, I'm leaving you for a competitor. We get down, once that's been a trend, we go, okay, dig into this further. I'm leaving you for competitor A, B, C. Similarly, it's the same with features. You might have a very broad churn reason that says, didn't have the feature I needed, and that becomes your dominant thing. You then might want to start to probe into that question and say, list some of the features you didn't have, like maybe it be the UI, the UX, or particular benefit statements you've got in your H1. Something wasn't meeting the mark. Try and get more specific on that to get that intelligence pull to build better for the next quarter, right? That's where churn reasons in particular become important.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm really glad we had this deep dive. I really enjoyed this first segment into churn and setting up the expectations around it. So this was great.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a good one. And it's highly relevant, always relevant. And one of those things where it seems simple in the start. Churn is just whoever can address it and plug that leaky hole in your revenue bucket. Then there's other things you need to consider with how you're getting in there.
Thank you so much, Luke.
Awesome.
This was a great chat.
Thanks, Andrea. Good chat. Talk soon.
Thanks. You too. Bye.